Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Land acquisition remains a vexed issue in the country today. Opposition to it comes from legitimate reasons. Farmers have generally been at the rough end of the transactions involving land acquisition. Remedies and recommendations have been bandied about, primarily concerning amendments to the Land Acquisition Act of 1894. We have with us here Dr. Smita Gupta, Senior Economist at the Institute of Human Development, and with whom we shall discuss this issue and the recommendations. Welcome to Newsclick.
Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Smita, is the chief concern about land acquisition today the loss of livelihood that it entails, or is it just that compensations are meager? What do you think is the chief concern for farmers vis-a-vis land acquisition?
Actually, compensation in my view is the least of the problems. Compensation as a problem is really being thrown up by the corporate media and by the corporate sector because they feel that you can fix it by giving more money. The issue is really of land use, and it's a question not just for farmers but the country as a whole. What do we want to use our land resources for? And in a country with our kind of food insecurity, it's really important to look at agriculture, to look at food security, to look at food self-sufficiency. So from the point of view of the national interest, it's very important to look at land use in a holistic perspective, far beyond what individual farmers want or don't want. And the second question is that, okay, you need to acquire land for several public purposes. But then how do you define public purpose? In other words, when is it justifiable to take the land from a farmer and transfer it to some other use? So the definition of public purpose has to go beyond a colonial interpretation to this question. And the third issue, again related to this point, is about the role of state. Is the state to play the role of a broker for the corporate sector? Is it a real estate agent? Not at all. Therefore, farmers' livelihoods are crucial, but they are a part of the larger question of food security, of land use, and what are the priorities of the nation today.
You think this kind of holistic approach to land acquisition is lacking in the both in the central government's initiative for amending the Land Acquisition Act, also state governments, various state governments in India's priorities, right? Do you think that's lacking there?
It's not just a question of lacking. See, the amendments are much required. The Land Acquisition Act is a colonial act. It needs to be changed. There's no doubt about it. But the direction of change which the central government is proposing is actually suicidal, because what they're saying is that let us make it cheaper, easier and quicker for the corporate sector to acquire land. This they're doing in many ways, by redefining public purpose, by reducing the amount of solatium that can be offered, and by allowing a huge amount of so-called market-based land acquisition. So therefore, the direction of amendments is completely faulty. And this is a problem not just of the central government, but also in the states, because much of the acquisition takes place by the state governments, and there they really misuse urgency. There are certain urgency clauses. So they misuse urgency clauses. Now, if you allow urgency in all cases, what it does is that the protest which farmers can make against public purpose, against land acquisition under clause 5B is not allowed. So therefore, the problem lies at both ends. And it is essential to conceive of the amendments in such a way that they're pro-farmer, that they're more equitable, and that land acquisition and displacement only occurs when very clearly established public purpose is served.
So from progressive circles, this is the refrain we hear as well. But at the same time, they also mention that instead of leaving land acquisition at the agency of the state government, you should involve the Gram Sabha for the purpose of land acquisition, because ostensibly they feel that since a farmer has a greater say in the Gram Sabha rather than to the agency of the state government, it's better off to leave land acquisition, decisions concerning land acquisition to the Gram Sabha. Do you think this provision that's being asked for is valid for all kinds of land acquisition?
Let me put it this way. If you look at the debate on land acquisition, you find that there are three approaches to it broadly. One I call the communitarian approach, where the cornerstone of that approach is that prior informed consent from the Gram Sabha is essential. And in the absence of that, no land acquisition should take place. Then there is the market-based approach, where they say that let the state get out of it and let it be a deal directly between the landowners and the people who want the land. And the third approach to which I subscribe is actually the state-led approach. But the state-led approach not of a kind which we've seen till now, where you have an absolute dictatorship of the state, but a decentralized democratic state. Therefore, the Gram Sabha has to play a very important role, but it cannot be the final authority. And the reason I say this is that there are many cases where Gram Sabhas are controlled by elites, in fact, much of the country. And these vested interests are not interested in land reforms. They are not interested in land redistribution. They're not interested in having any kind of public infrastructure for the poor, housing, etc. So there are times when they will veto their own land from being acquired for the larger public good. Therefore, while consent is important, the question is, what is the basis on which the decision will be taken? And that has to be the larger good.
You spoke about the communitarian approach, the private approach, and the state-centric approach. Let's talk specifically about the private approach. What do you think is the chief flaw in this approach that is being envisaged, where land acquisition would be left to the private developer to acquire directly from the landowner? What do you think is the chief flaw in this model?
You see, the understanding behind land acquisition and the role of state is that when a public good is being served, then you can acquire land even forcibly. But this does not mean that people are to give, that they have to part with their land without their rights being protected. And therefore, they have to be recognized as project-affected persons. Their rights in terms of future livelihood security, in terms of compensation, in terms of rehabilitation, all of these have to be protected in a very democratic way, with them playing a central role in it. Now, the moment you leave it to the market, the only thing they get is the price. Now, this price itself is not regulated. So, this price could be a fear price, that if everybody is going to sell, I'll be forced to sell. It may be a price based on some kind of force or compulsion, where there is money lending, where there are vested interests of various kinds who exert power on the rural economy. You're going to find people being forced to give up their land at a pittance. Therefore, this whole thing about market-based land acquisition hides behind it a huge violation of people's rights to resettlement, to rehabilitation, to compensation. Therefore, I think it's something which is extremely dangerous. And if we allow this trend to continue, it's going to result in a bloodbath. One
concern about land acquisition, and that's being played out in this protests in Bata Parsol in Uttar Pradesh, is that land is being acquired for purposes which is not necessarily for productive means, but rather for speculation, for garnering super profit. Do you think there should be express provisions to halt this kind of forms of land acquisition?
That it is very clear. In fact, the Supreme Court in many orders, and right at the beginning when the British passed this act in 1894, you'll be surprised to know that even they said that the government should not become a real estate agent for the private sector and for private profit. So, all kinds of infrastructure projects which are meant for the elite, real estate development and so on, cannot by any stretch of imagination be considered public purpose. And therefore, public purpose has to be defined in a very, very strict way and adhered to very, very strictly with no amount of discretion for the state. In addition to that, the agencies for whom it is acquired also have to be clarified. Only when there is government ownership or there is public sector ownership of the project, it should be acquired. Otherwise, there is no reason to acquire it for private profit. Therefore, I think it is absolutely essential. But all this would come into the definition of public purpose. If land is required by the corporate sector, the Act has a provision for that. And the current Act has a whole section on it. You will be surprised to know that the amendments which the central government is moving is actually removing that whole section. Now, their memorandum of understandings have to be signed. Very strict conditions have to be adhered to. They're deleting that and bringing the corporate sector into the definition of public purpose, making no distinction between public sector, private sector, state agencies. And this is going to be terrible.
So, we are in for a stronger set of protests by farmers now because of these provisions being removed from the Act per se, right?
I think land and land rights, which goes beyond land acquisition, issues like land eviction, land use changes, use of wastelands and marginal lands. But the land question is going to be the biggest question confronting the Indian state, and the leadership of this actually has to be with very responsible forces, because otherwise what you're going to find is sporadic acts of violence all over the country because the farmers are going to protest. and the state is going to react with this kind of mindless repression. So therefore, in the interest of our polity, in the interest of our democracy, if we don't address farmers' needs, farmers' issues, but more importantly, the national need for food security, for protecting the rights of the land-dependent people, we are going to be in for a very, very bad period.